This episode, I'm joined by Jacob Rollison, who is a Jacques Ellul scholar and the author of a new reading of Jacques Ellul, Presence and Communication in the Postmodern World, and editor of Jacques Ellul, a companion to his major works, along with Jacob E. Van Vleet. In this first part on the philosophy of Jacques Ellul, we discuss Ellul's critique of technological society and Ellul's understanding of propaganda, alongside a variety of other topics. This is part one of two on the philosophy of Jacques Ellul, with the second part being on Ellul's often overlooked spiritual and Christian writings. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers for making this work possible, and if you would like to support Hermitix podcast, it is greatly appreciated, or become part of the community, please find links in the description below. Enjoy. So, Jake Rollison, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks, James.
We are going to be discussing this is actually a first for Hermitix, in that I had to split this episode into two. I sort of asked, could we actually do two episodes, because recently released, which is co-edited by Jacob E. Van Vleet and yourself, Jacob Rollison, is Jacques Ellul, a companion to his major works, published by Cascade. Cascade Books, in a Cascade companion series, and they were nice enough to send me some copies of this, and then I didn't actually realize that they were going to send me some copies of Jacques Ellul Essential Spiritual Writings, and then upon research I realized I'm gonna really have to split this into two episodes, because these two strands of his thought, even though they are constantly overlapping, and like he makes that clear that one can't really be without the other, they are two things which, like, we wouldn't really have the time to go in-depth enough into either of them in the space of one hour or so. So this one is focusing on the work which most people would know Jacques Ellul for, which is the technological critique, his work on propaganda, and his work on sort of societal critique as well. But before we sort of jump in on all that, Jake, just sort of tell us a little bit about yourself and how this little companion came about, and how you sort of, came to be so interested in Ellul.
Sure. A bit about myself. I'm currently an independent scholar living and working in Strasbourg, France. Much of my recent work these last several years has indeed centered around the writings and legacy of Jacques Ellul. My academic background is a bit interdisciplinary, but in a way, Ellul is the thread that ties it all together. So for my bachelor's degree, I'm an American, as you can tell by my accent, I'm sure. I grew up in the US, and I went to Wheaton College, a small evangelical Christian college outside of Chicago. And I studied economics there, but I was continually questioning, what does it mean to study economics or philosophy or these other things at a Christian school? In other words, does theology change how one approaches economics, politics, society, philosophy, etc., or not? And if so, how? And so it was during this questioning that I providentially stumbled on Ellul. So Wheaton happens to house part of an enormous archive of Ellul's writings, possibly the largest outside of France, which is a bit ironic because he certainly doesn't fit in the American evangelical mold. But we'll come back to that later, I'm sure. So anyway, after studying economics at Wheaton, I went on to pursue a master's degree, which focused on the French thinkers that we often label postmodern, including Lyotard, Derrida, Deleuze, etc. And all the while, it felt like Ellul had something to say here, that he provided a robust response to postmodern questions on both sociological and theological levels. So for my PhD in theology, I set out to really dig into what that response was and see if and how it's meaningful today. So that was what got me to basically study Ellul for over a decade now. And then having finished the PhD, Jacob Van Vleet contacted me with a manuscript for the present book that you've read. And he asked me if I would read it over, and then he said, "Well, you know what? Actually, if you'd like, why don't you feel free to add some to it and edit it, and we can co-publish it." And he's a pleasure to work with. He's a very kind and generous scholar, so I was very happy to do that.
Okay. It sounds like a sort of a nice process. I mean, I also did my master's in on those sorts of philosophers, which are stereotypically labeled postmodern, even though no one will ever tell you what that exactly means. But
Right.
I stopped just before the PhD. So there we go.
Mm.
Before we sort of jump into Ellul's work specifically, I just have to ask you the Hermitix question, which is you can place three thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick? And as we are talking about a specific thinker, we can include Jacques Ellul and add three more.
Sure. So you'll notice that most of my choices are a bit overdetermined by my Ellul studies. So all my choices somehow live at this intersection between theology and everything else. So yes, we'll start with Ellul. Certainly, he has been a dialogue partner for over 10 years, and I've always said that I'll keep reading him until I stop learning from him, and I'm still going. So Ellul. Number two, I would say Soren Kierkegaard. He's in the background of Ellul for sure, but more broadly, he still looms very large in this Western intersection between theology and philosophy, and the way that these two fields intertwine with communication in his life and his works is fascinating. For my third choice, I decided to go with Paul Verrillo. So recently deceased, he was a French-Italian theorist of speed and of the accident, his two big themes. He often repeated the phrase, the invention of the ship was the invention of the shipwreck. And on the theology side, he's interesting because he was a practicing Roman Catholic. He treated similar themes as Ellul, but more from the philosophical perspective. And every time I read his stuff, it feels like every line is sometimes like a punch in the face. So he's a really rhetorically powerful thinker. And then for the final one, I'm not sure. I suppose I'd rather pull someone in who's doing something different from these others, since what they're doing kind of does follow a similar line of thought. I thought perhaps somebody like Václav Havel, who as a playwright and a politician is putting these things more into practice. And as far as I can tell, he was respected for being humble and reflective, even when in office. He modeled a kind of human and moral politics and put some of these other ideas into practice. So I thought he might be a nice fourth choice.
So do you mind if I ask, are you Catholic?
No, so Protestant. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a reason then? I mean, this is perhaps a bit of a heated question, but
sure.
Kierkegaard, Ellul, Verrillo, these are all thinkers who are sort of, I'm sure you might agree, not studied as vigorously as others. They don't really get as much stage time as the other thinkers. Do you think there is a connection to the Catholicism, thing there, or the religious sincerity there that isn't taken as seriously now, or do you think it might just be the fact of sort of fashion?
Well, it's interesting because I think in these three choices, at least, they were very aware of the. Well, let's say that first of all, yes, their Christian faith did actively play into their thought in a very unique way. As we dig into Ellul and his relationship to Kierkegaard, we'll see this. But both Ellul and Kierkegaard, they purposely made some of their works non-theological, and ended up making serious contributions in things that had nothing to do with their faith. And they did so intentionally. So Ellul, for example, used to warn his students when he would teach classes on the thought of Karl Marx. He would warn his students, now know that I'm a Christian, so it's possible that my biblical readings or whatever will factor in and kind of determine what I teach. So stay on guard against that. So far from trying to cultivate a sort of disciple attitude, he was much more like, careful that I don't accidentally influence what I'm trying to teach you. So yeah, very interesting in that way. And then Verrillo as well, his the Roman Catholic side is there for him. It's in the background, it's there, and it pops through now and then. He's not shy about it, but it certainly isn't. You have to kind of look for it to really find it. And the nice thing about all three, I think, is that a more fuller picture of them has to somehow deal with this theological side. So Kierkegaard, notoriously in France especially, was like basically the early Kierkegaard reception in France only focused on the philosophical Kierkegaard, and paid no attention to the theological element, which was very significant in his works. Ellul too, there's people who come to him from both sides without realizing the other side. And Verrillo, I think, is only starting to really be taken seriously in theology, but it's a slow and small start.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you think there's a reason why that theological thing is often missed? I mean, perhaps it's just because that isn't always the people who go into philosophy don't often think that they're going to have to deal with theology in that sense. They're so separate that I guess, you know, if you head towards Ellul thinking that you're going to be talking about technological critique, I guess it's surprising that you might have to sort of say, oh, okay, that this is actually completely tied in with some theology. That from a distance, that seems like it's not going to be the case.
Yes, I think that's fair to say. I think it's also like especially today. So after the second half of the 20th century, it's much rarer to find an active, like a faith that makes an active difference on an intellectual level in a lot of these things. We generally tend to set most of this in the category of religion, which makes it a kind of private matter or a side discussion that doesn't actively include all of public discourse. But the further you go back, the harder it is to do that. So even early 20th century, the extent to which you could assume a certain, at least familiarity with theological themes, if not a certain theological intention in general public discourse in a lot of European countries or Western discourse in general is much more pronounced. So today, I think it's helpful to have the categories, but yes, I think you're totally right that today we don't assume that we'll need them to understand sociology or the development of the West or technology. But what's nice about them, if we allow them to interrogate these other categories, which seem so a-religious, is that they offer a genuinely different perspective that can oftentimes be critical in ways that non-religious discourse can't.
Okay. So where do you think the conversation in that room might head towards?
That's a good question. I mean, I picked it the three because, like I said, there's a certain relationship affiliation between them, but they're also quite different. So they all have an aesthetic side. Ellul, his mother was a painter, and he grew up with a certain aesthetic sensibility. Kierkegaard, his writings in aesthetics, and well, I don't know, just the general irony and clownishness of his writings points to that for me. Verrillo was trained as an artist, I think, and did stained glass. He had done architecture for years before he started writing, and then Havel himself was a playwright before he was a politician. So to me, that would interest me to see what they would do with the aesthetic side of things, and knowing that they all are also keenly aware of politics and what that means theologically and just how all these things interacted. I think it would have to be a very interesting interdisciplinary conversation, but it couldn't avoid questions of ethics either. It would have to touch on human life. And that's what interests me more, is that when these questions come to bear on how we live. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm sure some of those thinkers, definitely the strand of Christianity or belief will come back in. But it's interesting, we already mentioned the the two sides to Ellul, and it does seem to me, perhaps I'm sort of projecting because this was just my experience of Ellul, but when I first heard about him, people speaking about him, it was just basically at first just the book The Technological Society and his criticisms of technology, and then occasionally a mention of the work Propaganda, because I think at the time people were on about Edward Bernays as well and things along these lines. So these were the two books I came across. So that whole sort of theological and Christian side to him was just basically non-existent when I first came across him. So, the question is why might one be deceived in thinking that they fully understand Ellul when really they only have this first part of the picture, which is the part of the picture which is the most pronounced. Unfortunately, that's just the technological criticism side.
Sure. So the short answer is because the picture is big and complicated. It is big because I think Ellul is explicitly trying to offer a kind of synthetic overall view of society as it was throughout the 20th century. But the trouble is he's trained in history as well. He's an historian of law and historian of institutions. And so he's also trying to do justice to what is different today from yesterday or from another place. And I think this is not easy because he thinks that society in the last 100 or 150 years has become so much more complicated. However, he's not just trying to write a kind of textbook of here's how things have changed. We know that he also rejected the kind of abstract ivory tower approach to thinking things through. Instead, he's hoping that his reader, the person who comes to his works, will hear what he is saying about where the society is heading and how it's evolving. His studies, you could say, have a communicative purpose. So his goal is to stimulate his readers to respond ethically, to come and exercise their own freedom. And here especially you can see Kierkegaard in the background. As you mentioned, some of Kierkegaard's works were kind of literary, poetic, and others were explicitly steeped in Christian theology and aimed to edify the reader. So Ellul, likewise, he purposely divided his works into two streams. One was, you could say, sociological or historical, and then another one is theological and ethical. So it's easy to misinterpret him if you only read one stream. In fact, before we started recording, James and I briefly discussed Ted Kaczynski, he's not the Unabomber, but the Oklahoma City bomber. Is that it? I think?
Oh no, he is the Unabomber.
Or the Unabomber. Yeah. Yes, right. So so he's one who is perhaps the most infamous interpreter of Ellul. And I think he's a perfect case of someone who only read one side and not very carefully either. Because if you read only Ellul's analyses, in a way, Ted Kaczynski's response is not impossible. To think that he would read it and say, "This is where everything is going. How can we have any freedom?" And he is, that kind of questioning is part of Ellul's intention. But for Ted Kaczynski to then say, so the answer is bonds and violence, is a total failure because it doesn't take into account Ellul's ethical writings. So for both thinkers, both Ellul and Kierkegaard behind him, it's not just one part of their work that counts, and it's not the whole thing, but it's actually the relationship between each part and the rest. So since they both wrote a ton of books, before you can actually perceive those relations, you have to do a lot of reading, which is not easy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, sort of, in short, then it's not a scornful criticism. When he is critiquing society, he's also sort of making it clear that one should have, as you say, an ethical approach to this criticism and sort of try to figure out what you can do from that, as opposed to just this thing is bad. Here is why it is bad.
Yes, that's right. And it's also worth noting that so Ellul tried to have a very realist approach to his analyses of society. And for him, sometimes that meant giving the diagnosis or just stating how things were as clearly as possible, even if that means hopeless. And sometimes it did. So for example, at the end of his life, he was doing an interview with Patrick Chastanet, who was one of his, he was his teaching assistant, one of his longtime students. And Chastanet asked him something like, why should we read both sides of your work? Why should we read the whole thing and not just one side? And Ellul basically said, well, if you only read my sociological studies, it would probably drive you to suicide. The hope is located in the theological side. But that doesn't mean that he set out to say everything is hopeless. He became convinced that way as he looked at things. But yeah, I think it's important to realize that even though there is a kind of rhetorical element, there's also it's a rhetorical element with a very scientific mind in the same book.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't know if that's helpful or clear or not.
No. I think that's clear. But I guess, when we're talking about criticism of technology, Ellul does sort of have some specific language, which I think,
yes.
The term technological brings up so many connotations and images. I think for most people, they would think of something like high tech or a computer or a piece of chipboard or something like that. But he uses the term technique in relation to technological society. So what does he mean by this?
Yes, so that's a great question because it's so central to everything that he's writing, especially on the sociological side. And I think that one of the best ways to answer this is to situate this question within Ellul's overall goal of understanding the evolution of society. So certainly another one of his influences, Karl Marx, is in the background here, and we'll come to Ellul and Marx a bit further on. But so Ellul adopted Marx's understanding of the evolution of society. And in this understanding, various forces are held in a state of tension at any given moment in society, or there are various tensions that are kind of working their way through. And so if you want to, for example, forecast how society is going to change and how it'll evolve, you've got to understand these forces and be able to pick out which one is the strongest at a given moment, which is the determining factor. So for Ellul, he thought that Marx was right for his time when he named capital or economics as the driving force in social evolution, and then devoted his analysis to capital. However, for the 20th century, when Ellul is alive, he thinks that times have now changed, and Marx's work the same method that Marx applied must be applied again to create a new analysis for today, or the today of the 20th century. And so that's what Ellul set out to do, along with his best friend, Bernard Charbonneau. And excuse me, we might say that for Ellul, technique is the answer to the question, what drives societal change in the 20th century West? And so as that helps situate what technique is, but what does Ellul mean by it? Well, it's both simple and not simple. In the 1964 English translation of The Technological Society, he offers this one-line definition. Technique is the totality of methods rationally arrived at and having absolute efficiency for a given stage of development in every field of human activity. It's a mouthful, so if you need to pause this recording and go back and listen to it again, I understand. In a way, it's a quest for the one best way to do things. Mm-hmm. He notes that, many times we think of technique in connection with machines. And this is not unimportant, but it's not everything. For him, the machine is pure technique. But the thing is, notice that in his definition, he writes, in every field of human activity. So you might say that technique is the logic of the machine applied to all of life. So much of his classic book focuses on technique in politics, in economics, and then in daily human life. I think it's also worth noting that this definition includes its own evolution over time, which is why he writes for a given stage of development. So technique implies and necessitates a permanent evolution and a permanent kind of self-augmentation.
Could we possibly say that technique is also to do with the relationship that humans have to technology, or is technique entirely within the object which we are coming into communication with?
No, you're totally right. It's a very human thing, and it has to do with precisely the relationship between humanity and their tools, their techniques, their technologies. No, I think that's very correct to say. in a way, we sometimes describe it as a kind of objective science or an objective process, but that's the irony, is we misrecognize the way that we're involved in that objectivity.
Okay, I'm now sort of wondering whether or not, because this is much like Heidegger's famous question concerning technology, I was just wondering if Ellul ever commented on that at all.
That's right. So Ellul was it's interesting. Ellul was aware of Heidegger, but for most of his career, he purposely rejected using him or drawing on his stuff, because he was aware from the beginning of Heidegger's affiliation with the Nazi Party. However, so Heidegger's essay on technology, if I'm not mistaken, I think it comes out in 1954. Ellul's, which is the same year actually that the Technological Society is published in French. Mm-hmm. But Ellul's was, the Technological Society was written, it was completed at least around 1948, so several years earlier. But yes, all that to say, yes, I think the two are related. Ellul thinks that in a way, this objectivity that we ascribe to the technological process or operation is a mistake, is a sort of capitulation or at least misrecognition of our own freedom, of our own role in creating it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I guess the problem then is that this, whatever the relationship we have towards technology is, or towards technique is, it does tend to bolster its own approval. I'm not really sure how it does it, but it came across in my research that mm-hmm. it does do this. There is a collective acceptance of our, I guess, subjective acceptance of technique, right? So
yeah.
In what sense does, basically, I guess in simple language, in what sense does technology sort of consistently prove to us, whether or not that it is true or not, consistently prove that, it is the best thing for us to always be using?
Sure. So in a way, it's simply because it works. Like a good machine, either it produces or it doesn't. And if it does, its results are obvious and again, factual is a good word here. If this machine works and that machine doesn't, well, it seems as obvious as 2 + 2 = 4. Or if this machine works better than that machine, that's as obvious as 10 is bigger than 9, And so in our society, you might say that our post-Enlightenment heritage has taught us to place a kind of ethical value, a good on facts and objectivity. And so in a way, technique, you might say it falls in line with one of our central collective values. Before we move on, I wanted to mention again in connection with Heidegger. Yes, so I know at least Carl Mitchen has compared Ellul to Heidegger and grouped them within kind of the humanities critiques of technology. Mm-hmm. And Ellul is often seen as pessimistic in his report, in his relationship to technique or technology, and likewise Heidegger's in his essay on the question concerning technology, he talks about the danger that technology poses, which in framing constitutes for humanity. So in a way, they both, while they have very different approaches, Ellul is much more of a historian and a sociologist than a philosopher in the way that Heidegger was. They both recognize that without a certain human freedom pushing back on it, it does pose a problem for the way we perceive and understand the world around us.
It's interesting what you say there, though, that it works. Technology is sort of bolstered because it works, which actually sort of draws us back to Verrillo's famous quote, you know, you invent the shipwreck.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of the things that I guess is overlooked that that I've touched on with quite a few people on the podcast before, is that people love technology because it solves problems, and as you say, it's sort of productive, it's efficient. But the irony is that it's only efficient and it only solves problems which were made by its own sort of arrival. So it sort of comes along and develops this problem. So sort of like cars, but for instance, cars become a universal thing. There's the problem of car crashes, and then we invent more technology, and we sort of bow down to technique even more, and then believe we've solved something. But really, the question is never addressed of, well, how about we go back and see what actually caused the problem and see whether or not we actually need cars as much as we do, for instance.
Yeah.
So, I mean, perhaps the underlying question there is, does Ellul ever see like a deceleration or a technological regression as a possible positive, or is he sort of like, this is what we've got, let's just assess this?
So that's a good question. It's interesting because today he and especially Charbonneau in France, they're receiving a lot of attention from what's called the degrowth movement, or décroissance in French, and which is exactly about this. Is about descaling technologically and in some ways politically as well. So as to whether Ellul thinks descaling, like shrinking of things is possible, he certainly hopes so, and I think he does believe it is, which is what he calls to. But he recognizes that, in a way, what he's saying is, hey, you abandon your power. He's literally calling. So later on, he talks about an ethics of non-power, and he distinguishes non-power from powerlessness or power. So, for example, powerlessness as you can't do something, you don't have the power to do it. There's the power to do something, which means you can do it. Or there's non-power for him, which simply means you have the power to do it and you refuse. And it's that third one for him, which is the realm in which freedom can act. And that's also what he thinks is necessary in this time. So at the very least, he's calling humanity to actively choose limits and to not simply do everything that we can do. But that's the unpopular and difficult, if you will, element, especially in a system which is driven on this sort of competition in which I better do it quickly or someone else will,
Yeah, I mean, the sort of artificially created scarcity and the pressure to consume. I mean, this is sort of where, I guess, that third ethical stance you put in, you have the power to do it, but you refuse, or you just say, no, I don't want to do it, is where the real freedom comes in. But of course, this is then where propaganda comes in, the idea that you do have to partake in these things for whatever reasons. And, is this what Ellul would sort of call a style of life, is then built from this? You have this power to, I don't know, consume various things or partake in technique, and certain communication channels are sort of have you believe that you need to partake in these things.
Yes, certainly. So, like, for example, recently I was looking on, as part of preparing a class on some of these issues, I was looking at a neuromarketing website, and the neuromarketing website, they're trying to sell their services to advertisers, saying we can help you more effectively create demand in consumers because we know how their brains work, basically. And it's not as black and white as that, certainly. No one is claiming that they climb inside your brain and pull the levers and knobs that control you. But they actively are saying that because we can research brains the way we do, we know how consumers react in a way better than they do, better than they know themselves. And in that way, yeah, there is a certain tailoring of communication to the end of propaganda, which is to say, it's communication that's designed not to address one, but to obtain an effect. But yeah, we can come back to propaganda in a minute or two if you'd like. But yeah, or should I just jump into it with propaganda?
Yeah, you can jump into propaganda.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Okay, let me see. I have some notes on it here. So yeah, propaganda. I mean, basically, what's interesting on it, the relationship between Ellul and propaganda, is that it comes about because of his own awareness of his reactions in certain situations. So in the 30s, I think 1935, he's invited to Germany by some Protestant associations, and out of curiosity, he attends a Nazi rally, and he finds this situation impressive. He, at the end of his life, in that interview I mentioned earlier, he's asked, "Well, so you were there? Did you raise your hand and salute with everyone else?" And he said, "No, I didn't, but it was difficult not to." And the stares and looks that we got from the people around us were just very frightening. So he goes away from the situation saying, "Wow, look at the power that just being placed in that spot, in that weird context, exerted on me." And so this is part of what leads him to set out and study the phenomenon of propaganda. And I think it's important to be careful, because when we hear propaganda today, we tend to think, we tend to think of the Nazis or the communists saying, in a kind of black and white way, this is what's right or this is not. Or we tend to think that propaganda means lies. Or again, we tend to think that propaganda means that I'm like a marionette puppeteer pulling the strings and making people think something. When it's, for Ellul, it's much broader than that. It's much more subtle than that. And it's much more accurate than that. So he notes that Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, always insisted that that the facts used in propaganda be as accurate as possible, and that when possible they should use truths and report only facts and not make things up. Occasionally they did when they knew they could get away with it, but for the most part they would focus more on manipulating a true fact by placing it in a perhaps falsified context. But anyway, all that to say, for Ellul, propaganda is something much bigger. It includes, yes, certainly it includes communist propaganda or Nazi propaganda, but he also notes democratic propaganda. He has long sections on American propaganda, on public relations as a kind of propaganda, on advertising and publicity. So all that to say, it's a much larger thing. And in terms of your question about style of life, the trouble with that is that in simple terms, propaganda tells you you are right, and sometimes it adds that other people are wrong, or perhaps it might elevate a relative value into something absolute, or it might assign a positive or negative moral value to something without such value, or it might strengthen or weaken values which are already there. And this isn't always a conscious process either. I'll give you an example. There was the 2015 film Concussion, which centers on the Nigerian-American doctor Bennett Omalu and his research on brain damage in American football players. And in this film, there's a certain sentimentality attached to the fact that Omalu becomes an American citizen, that he exemplifies American values. Now, this is only comprehensible, or it only makes sense kind of from within a perspective in which being American already bears a kind of positive moral value. And this was obvious to me, an American, in part because I watched the film with Canadian friends living in the United Kingdom. This film reinforces the strong role that American football plays in life in the US. It promotes US nationalism, probably unconsciously. The point is, I don't need to imagine that the film director was kind of scheming to control the minds of the masses. And yet, here this film goes and reinforces an American way of life. So in that way, it could be seen as, it could fall under what Ellul categorizes as sociological propaganda.
Okay. Do you think then that our relationship with propaganda, even though it seems that we're doing things from, we see or we hear or we believe these certain things which are told to us, these supposed truths, or whether or not they're true, it doesn't really matter, it's the way they're communicated to us. Do you think, even though we believe we're acting on them, that really this leads us towards a state of sort of neutrality, of, passivity, where we're actually not thinking?
Oh, that's a good question. The trouble is, the best propaganda doesn't, So another quote from Goebbels, if I didn't say it already, Goebbels said, "We do not talk to say something, but to obtain a certain effect." So it's important to remember that propaganda generally isn't trying to convince you consciously. It's not going to make a rational argument that appeals to you and say this or that. It'll appeal to things more like fears or insecurities. Or, like I said, it will give you a true fact, but just place it in a slightly falsified context. Or the goal will be to simply to get you to react a certain way. So, so again, right now in the U.S., everybody's talking about January 6th and the riots on Capitol Hill. It's a tough thing because on the one hand, I think that when he was president, Trump was a kind of expert at using his Twitter account to, without going over the line and saying things explicitly, he was kind of using it to either assuage certain opinions or incite. And in that case, you could call that a kind of agitation propaganda, what went on there. And certainly that's how the Democrats want it to be interpreted. The downside, or the flip side to that from the Democratic side, is that in their interpretations, which they say this is obvious that it's interpreted this way, that it has to be interpreted this way, the opposite side is going to see what they say and say, oh, well, clearly that's propaganda from the Democratic side. So in a sense, you enter this absence of communication in which what we say only kind of reinforces ourselves. Sorry, I think I got off track. Can you bring me back to what the question was?
Whether or not propaganda leads, sort of renders you passive.
Right. So again, if it's meant to render you passive, it's not. I would say it's more that it blocks you from interpreting things in a different way. But part of the trouble that Ellul highlights with propaganda is that in today's society, we need it, sometimes actively and sometimes we desire it. So one of the difficulties with politics today is that everyone kind of feels the need to have an opinion on everything. But Ellul notes the trouble is that if you're working a full day and you go home and you have a full day with the family and everything, you don't have time to sit down and actively analyze everything that happens. So in a way, you kind of need reactions. You need an opinion on something kind of prefabricated for you. And so that's the role that the news plays. It gives us a way to think about things, which saves us the work of developing a nuanced opinion. And that way we can still talk about it and save face when somebody mentions it and they look at us and they say, what, you haven't heard about that? You don't know? Mm-hmm. And so in a way, it kind of fulfills a need to feel informed, a need to feel like we are actively analyzing these things when simply we don't have the time.
So for Ellul, was it important to try break out of this propaganda sort of machine, or was it more important to sort of just recognize it and say, actually, I don't even really need to listen to the news at all? Like, that's a choice just as well. If the news is giving you the blue and the red options of opinion, of course, if you understand it's propaganda, you might form a third option and say, well, actually, I believe nothing of those two. I'll create my own opinion. But equally, there is the choice of saying, I'm going to turn off the TV. So is one of these more important to Ellul? Is it more important to simply realize propaganda and step away, or is it more important to sort of form your own opinion, or is it a bit of both?
So I would say it's definitely more of for Ellul, like I guess stepping away would be useful if you knew that everything you were hearing was purely propaganda and it was lies, or it would be worth listening to, but extremely critically. But for him, the point was never to step away or kind of get out of things, but to actively fight through it and search for a truth beyond it, or in really digging through it. So, for example, when he talks about in his books on either propaganda or technological society, when he starts by He doesn't want to say, okay, here's my definition of technology or technique or propaganda. He starts by sifting through, okay, I've read these other books and this person says this, and here's the problems I find with his definition. And this other guy says this, and he's right about this, but his definition lacks this. And so it's a very considered and nuanced. I've read like 50 different sources and I've sifted through them and I've thought, and so here's what I'm coming to. To get there, Ellul has to be just, like that's what I'm talking about when he talks about the time to really analyze a thing in depth and with nuance. To have, that kind of an opinion on any political issue. So, for example, I don't know, on Brexit or Donald Trump's impeachment trials, like you would have to sit down and really analyze a lot of stuff to have a truly intellectual opinion on it, a well-reasoned and argued stance. But nobody's going to sit down and read 50 books to figure out what they really think about that. They want to talk about it today with their friends at work or in the bar, and that's kind of it. So I would say for him, no, it's definitely a question more of propaganda. It's worth analyzing because you can learn something about both yourself and the propagandist, if you will, what they're after. But it's worth knowing that what you hear in it is not going to be the full story.
Okay. For Ellul, was it ever possible to sort of get back to a life of sort of complete truth, or is that always going to be an uphill struggle?
So it doesn't. I mean, it doesn't have to be. But I would say that the alternative to propaganda might simply be called dialogue, or at least on the level of the spoken word. It means that you abandon the intention of manipulating or controlling with your words or with your communications, and you actually open yourself to a back and forth relationship with another speaker. Now, that doesn't guarantee that you will attain the truth, but for Ellul, it is how you get closer to it. So he later wrote a book called The Humiliation of the Word, in which he goes into detail about truth, and he makes a distinction between truth and reality. And we can dig into that more if you'd like, but it is a good question, because in the way he describes us in the 20th and now 21st century, in our societies, we basically do get so used to living among propagandistic messages that real dialogue is more like a rarity.
So yeah, if I could sort of pry there, what is the difference there between truth and reality?
Sure. So for Ellul, in Humiliation of the Word, he makes what he admits is an oversimplified distinction between truth and reality. And he says, for my purposes in this book, I'm going to connect truth to the word and to the spoken word specifically, and so to hearing. And then he connects reality to visual images, which are so connected to seeing. And in that book, one of the things he's really on about is how language works, or what language gives us, and what's the relationship between our lives and our spoken word. And so when he talks about truth, he doesn't mean that all words are true, or all words can give us access to truth, but he means that truth is an exclusively linguistic phenomenon. So if you do want to talk, like once you see images, once you look at things, it's ambiguous and it calls for a kind of interpretation. So words are the thing that brings truth into play for Ellul.
Okay. Moving sort of forward then, I guess, into that form of truth and how Ellul is assessing the world. This was something that was interesting to me, and probably is, I imagine, as a Ellul scholar, or any type of scholar, when you get into political readings and people's political affiliations, it's always the point, I guess, where there's going to be disagreements. But what is Ellul's relationship with Marx? Because he uses a lot of the language, and yet later on I have the question of whether or not Ellul believes in progress, which
and teleology as well, which is two sort of things where he could veer off from Marx. So, initially, what is his relationship with Marx and Marxism?
Well, the short answer is it's complicated. When he was young, Ellul read everything that Marx had ever written, and that was kind of a revolutionary moment for Ellul. So Marx gave him a synthetic picture, a way to understand the world around him. And he specifically mentions that for him at that time when he was young, he felt, all of a sudden I understand why my father is unemployed and the things around him in Bordeaux. And so, it was kind of an aha moment that Marx gave him. So Ellul's his own sociology borrows much from Marx's method, and he keeps it for his entire life. He later says that he found no other method which would allow him to analyze society and specifically make such accurate predictions for how things would evolve. But for most of the 20th century in France, it's worth noting that Marxism was seen as a very progressive and morally positive idea. So most intellectuals at least go through a Marxist phase, like Jean-Paul Sartre, and their approaches to Marxism are sometimes very dogmatic. So Marxism becomes a moral truth in France in a way that it simply doesn't in some other countries. Ellul never really fell into that. So he never joined the French Communist Party. He never became dogmatic about Marx's ideas about revolution or whatever. You might say that he held more to Marx's method than to his conclusions. It's also worth noting here that this method was in tension with Ellul's theology. So Marx said that atheism was the entryway into his thought. So while Ellul recognized that it's impossible to be both a Christian and then truly Marxist, he nevertheless owed a debt to Marx, which it's hard to really separate from the rest of his work. As an example, once in a TV interview, they said they called him a Marxologist, and Ellul responded, "Well, Marxologist, yes, but more than that." And he has that complicated thing where he doesn't want to say, "Yes, I'm a Marxist," because he knows what that implies. But at the same time, he recognizes this has played a heavy personal and theoretical role for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he does tend to sort of use Marxist language in his thought, though. Specifically, I noticed alienation. And does this tie in with his sort of notion of propaganda? And do you think that, in terms of someone finding an authentic reality for their self, that when you're in a position of alienation, really, what is it for Ellul that you're within when you are alienated in this sense?
Sure. So I would say certainly Marxist thinking ties into Ellul's notion of propaganda. Marx spoke about true, consciousness and false consciousness. And in a way, that could be what propaganda is. It maintains a sort of dream state. But the thing is, it's more complicated than, it's not like a machine that acts on us and maintains that state. Again, the trouble is that we're sort of involved in it from the beginning. We kind of desire that. So yes, I would say that Marx's, alienation does translate into a lot of Ellul's work. As for whether or not we could say something about them being their true self, I think that's where, in a way, that allows us to see the limits of how we could call Ellul a philosopher. The question of one's true self seems nearly metaphysical, and I would say that Ellul's thinking never really goes in that direction. In fact, one time he says something like, "I have succeeded in only in questions that have interested me. Now, finding my true self finding myself who I was has never been interesting for me." But it's worth, I think another important thing to mention here is that one of Ellul's biggest criticisms of Marx has to do with how Marx treats the human. Ellul calls the human one of the biggest problems in Marxism. He thinks that, without realizing it, Marx basically borrows a bourgeois conception of human freedom, which was popular in his time, even though it doesn't and shouldn't fit into the rest of his thought. But he also recognizes that Marx changes over time on the question of the human. So you could say that maybe the closest Ellul gets to a set anthropology, a set thinking about humanity, is this idea of freedom, but it's tricky, and it's even perhaps though it's less than dogmatic in Ellul's thought. He doesn't say freedom is the human or something. It's still a pretty tricky and evolving question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how does Ellul sort of work out a position where, you know, we briefly touched on it earlier with propaganda, in that everything is sort of politicized, and, you know, especially these days, literally everything can be a political decision, which in itself is sort of a form of propaganda. Or at least, you know, I guess it's wrong to always see propaganda in that negative context. Really, it's just understanding that things are trying to, you know, alter how you view the world in some way. Whether or not that's good or bad, is the question itself. But, you know, this increased sort of politicization of everyday life in relation to this concept of alienation, does Ellul see it as, I mean, you know, I tried to move away from binary good and bad, but does Ellul see it as a positive to sort of view your life from that political angle, where you sort of understand yourself to be X or Y in a political sense? Or is that, you know, once again moving, you know, into the realms of that which he is critiquing?
Right, that's a good question. I think he would be more negative on that. So, for example, I would say that if we think about like the origins of the secular state in the West, in many cases it originated as a way to get out of, or to put an end to, religious wars, religious disputes. One aim of severing the church from the state was to ensure a kind of minimum of freedom from coercion, or freedom to discuss and to debate. But today, the role of the state, of politics in daily life, is much different and much larger. So the size of this supposedly neutral area of life has immensely expanded. And I don't just mean in terms of bureaucracy. Now, certainly this is different in various countries. So the separation of church and state in the US is a very different thing from French laïcité. But in both cases, everything from greeting someone in the street to choices of where to shop or what to buy, all of these things can be seen as political statements. The adoption of one of a set number of positions on a certain spectrum. But the trouble with that is that politics is thus no longer just a question of maintaining a negative bare minimum of freedom for discussion. It comes to be something that encompasses all of our speech, our life, and our choices. And so Ellul, and even more so his friend Charbonneau, really spent their lives protesting that kind of absorption of all of human life into politics. Yeah. Okay. So I hope that's a good start.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that actually does sort of, in a strange way, move me into the next question, which is to do with progress, which is sort of, I guess the political sphere is all about that notion of, you know, acting and being an activist in the sense that you're working towards something which is progressive, which will progress us in some way towards, I guess, one's definition of what it is to progress. But, you know, in the episode that I did with Christian Roa on Charbonneau, it's clear to me that Charbonneau was, as you say, he just sort of went into the country, right, and just taught people these sort of sustainable ways of living and getting back to nature, etc., which wouldn't really be included in this notion of progress. That would just be sort of, not to sound too cheap, but, you know, living in the moment and actually doing the Marxist thing of what's the famous quote? The job of a philosopher is not to think about the world; it's to change the world. Is that it? I can't remember. But you know,
I think so.
It seems that Charbonneau was doing that on a very small, simple scale, which he saw perhaps not as progress, but as, you know, almost a move away from progress, to say, right, let's stop, let's sort of go back and just almost go back to basics. So, you know, is there because the contemporary definition of progress for me is a very difficult one. Do you think there is such a thing as progress for Ellul? Because I guess my point from the previous question is that progress now is inherently tied to that politicization of everything.
Yeah. So the short answer is no. The way that we use the word progress or progressive Ellul would almost wholeheartedly reject it. So certainly there's things like technological progress. There are increases in certain types of knowledge, scientific progress, etc. That's undeniable, and Ellul never certainly denies those things. But what progressions in this kind of knowledge mean for the life of humans is a much more interesting, but less black and white question. In a moral sense, we can only call certain things progressive, I would say, by ignoring a lot of the details which make them what they are. I'll give you one example from Ellul's life. So since the 1960s, and especially in a special way in France, in much of the West, the fact that increasing numbers of women seek full-time work outside of the home is often counted as a sign of progress in a moral sense, usually within the framework of some civil rights, and this is often accompanied by a sort of general disparaging of the idea that being a simple housewife is either an antiquated or an enslaving position. And in this discourse, liberation from this position might imply that women find their true dignity in work outside the home, or that they really achieve their personal development in a career, etc. Now, Ellul was completely against this position, though it would be a ridiculous error to think that he or his wife were thereby somehow politically conservative on this issue. So when Ellul meets his wife, Yvette, she had abandoned her Catholic origins and she was interested by Nietzsche's critiques of Christianity. They met at a right-wing protest where they were both working against the protesters. And in a 1966 book of Marxist-inspired critique of language, Ellul devotes a chapter to critiquing the idea that women find their freedom and their dignity in work. Now, Ellul's wife, who read everything he wrote before it was published, would never have let something like that slip without having thought it through. So all that to say that categorizing his position as either progressive or conservative or reactionary would really be to miss a great opportunity at good conversation on these important topics. So I would say that that's one way that what passes for politics today stuffs the complexity of life into kind of oversimplified categories. It only works by reducing or ignoring a lot of this complexity so that it can be, safely managed from a distance, I guess.
Okay. Is Ellul careful to sort of give advice to people? Because it seems that Ellul's philosophy at times does sort of tiptoe close to, are we getting close to like, this is how we should comport ourselves, this is what we should do. Is he careful to give any practical advice of how one can exist within this world which he's laid out on even on a physical, because obviously Charbonneau is doing this sort of almost a French back to the land movement. Does Ellul do anything like this, or is he just giving a theoretical framework which then people can use, subjectively?
So, it's a good question, and it's interesting that you mentioned Charbonneau with that too, because in a way, Ellul and Charbonneau, they're different, but they're like complementary. So Ellul always wrote that he wrote about technique because he struggled with it himself. From the time he was a teenager, he worked his mind and his body like a machine. He said that he even once employed Taylor's system of scientific management on himself to handle everything that he had to do. He worked like a robot. He often worked 10 hours a day for years on end. And he certainly made a concentrated effort to become aware of the ways that he was obeying these technical or the imperatives of technique. And you could say that by integrating himself in a large state university for his whole career, he certainly didn't distance himself from the rest of society. But yeah, Charbonneau was very different. Charbonneau purposely chose a career as a teacher in a high school, far from big cities and closer to nature. For Charbonneau, the sentiment of nature, as he says in an early writing, was a revolutionary force. And so for Charbonneau, living close to and really experiencing and living with nature, not just having nature as an idea, but knowing what it is because you live in it and with it and love it, was crucial. Now, that's it. I don't think the thing is which one do you choose, Ellul or Charbonneau. I honestly think you probably need both, and that might be a good starting point to have a physical dialogue between the city, between a concentrated experience of human civilization and nature or creation, between the world that humanity has built and this other world that finds itself within the natural world. But especially in today's world, that kind of a lived dialogue can be quite difficult, especially for a city dweller, because as mentioned, for us, the word nature can just be the subject of such cheap romanticism. But anyway, that's a starting point, I suppose.
Okay. So do you think there's different... Is there any ends for either of those thinkers, I guess? I mean, specifically Ellul, but is there a place that we're going, or is this just another episode in history, this episode of technique, which will, mutate into something else?
That's a good question. I think in a way, no, in the sense that Ellul doesn't really give a teleology of so if he's trying to describe how this machine of society is developing, he doesn't say here's how it should develop. I guess the closest you get really is kind of human freedom as a benchmark. So what he really wants to see is in response to technique, he wants to see humanity assert its own freedom, and in other words, he thinks that in a way, this technical world we've made now creates the imperatives that define how it relates to us. And so in a way, we've lost, if we had an upper hand, it's not that it's a struggle between machines or whatever, between humans and machines, but in a way we've lost the sense for it. So for him, the ends that we set out to achieve by creating all these technological things have been lost in the proliferation of the means that we make to achieve them. So he would like humanity to rediscover some of their own ends, but he doesn't want to say, and so here's what those ends should be as much. It's also tricky because this question opens the door into his theological writings, but we'll try to keep that door closed for now, or at least mostly shut.
Yeah, I mean, that's why one of the questions that I had right at the beginning, I'll probably put in nearer the end here, so it sort of ties us to the next episode, which I hope you're still up for doing after this. Which is that does the key overlap, I think, is that does the technological society become the sort of the new religious foundation for the majority of people? Is that I guess you could sort of say specifically in the West, is it our new religion?
So that's a good question. It's I think it might not be wrong to say that technique does kind of become a new religion, but I think it would be, at least sticking to the terms Ellul uses, it would be more precise to say that technique becomes our new sacred. So he has a book called The New Demons, where he explains what he means by this, and the sacred might be said to be an environment which orients everything else. It is what defines the perspective from which somebody sees the world. So, for example, he writes that religion is one possible rendition of the sacred. You might say that the category of religion is the way that a certain search for a kind of transcendence from the technical world appears, but from within a world that's already defined by technique itself. So on an ethical level, the sacred is what orients human action, and it is associated with both hopes and fears. And now Ellul schematically suggests three major sacreds throughout Western history. First, nature. In other words, the primitive person needs to live by nature to survive, and so nature offers both hopes for survival, but also the threat to survival, in the sense that nature is where the animal that might kill them is coming from. After this, the nature is desacralized, if you will, by Christianity, especially the church under Christendom becomes a certain sacred, in the sense that the church bears the keys to eternal salvation, and so if you don't go through the church, then you're cut off from it. But so the church is both your hope for and what prevents you from the idea of eternal salvation. And so now Ellul thinks the third sacred is technique, which profanes the church and profanes Christianity as a Western sacred. So technique now becomes an environment, and in this, you might think of this with the response to the COVID crisis, especially in France. It feels like, and sometimes it explicitly is, the government officials saying, look, whatever for all the rest, but we have to keep the economy running. And why? Why do we have to keep the economy running? What's going to happen if we don't? Unemployment, and then the whole list starts of all the horrible things that will happen if we don't keep the economy running. Now, I'm not trying to minimize the real consequences of that. All I'm trying to say is that in that sense, by orienting our decisions in such a clear way, the economy or the technique that underlies economic thinking has become a sort of new sacred. So yeah, in a way, technique, that the logic of absolute efficiency does it represent a sacred with its own rituals and myths, and yeah, it is in Ellul's view, and I think that it still applies to a lot of today, that which orients our ethical decision making.
Okay. This episode will probably be just after an episode on René Girard, and I know it's a couple of overlaps there with the sacred and also the Catholicism. Does Ellul have a comment on Girard's work at all?
A bit. So actually, it's interesting. There's a guy here in Strasbourg who's just starting a PhD on Ellul and Girard. So in the future we'll have a much better answer to that. But there's only, to my knowledge, there's only one major writing where Ellul addresses Girard, and it's in French. It's called Theology and Technique, and it's a book published posthumously, so after Ellul's death. And he has a few essays, basically he talks about Girard and Dostoevsky and this connection in Dostoevsky's underground man, the underground spirit. And I think Girard has written some things about that as well. So that's the only place he really talks about it, but I can't say much about how I think he appreciated him and entered into appreciative dialogue and occasional disagreement with what he read from Girard, but it's relatively minor in the list of authors with whom Ellul is in dialogue.
Okay. Is there anything you would like to add that you feel we've missed?
Only that I talked too much. I wish I hadn't, but then we could have gotten to more questions. But no, I have nothing to add. I think that looking forward to the next installment.
Yeah. Whereabouts can we find this the companion to his major works?
Oh, right. So the book that I've published with Jacob Van Vleet.
Yeah.
So you can order it through wipfandstock.com, wipfandstock.com. I mean, it's on Amazon and stuff too, but I think Wip and Stock usually has some discount on there if you order it from them. So yeah.
Okay. Jake Rollison, thanks very much.
Thanks very much, James. It's been a pleasure.